and Kenyan shillings. The girl stared vacantly at the flies, obviously resigned to the fact that she never did any business at all. After a while, we became quite interested in watching the flies as well. At last we were told that our flight was ready to depart again, and we returned to our plane load of missionaries. Where, we wondered, had they been while all this had been going on? We didn't ask. After an hour or so, we landed at last at Bukavu, and as we taxied up to the terminal shacks of the airport, the plane resounded to happy cries of, "Oh, how wonderful, the bishop's come to meet us." And here he was, big and beaming in his purple tunic, wearing glasses with frames that were black at the top and transparent at the bottom. The missionaries, the mission school teachers, and the American couple who were merely very interested in missionary work climbed smiling out of the plane, and we, pausing to pull our camera bags out from under our seats, followed them. We were in Zaïre. I think the best way of explaining what goes so hideously wrong with Zaïre is to reproduce a card we were given by a tourist officer a few days later. One section of it was written in English and is for the benefit of the tourist. It goes like this. Madam, Sir, on behalf of the President-Founder of the MPR, President of the Republic, of his government, and of my fellow citizens, it is agreeable for me to wish you a wonderful sojourn in the Republic of Zaïre. In this country you will discover majestic sights, a luxuriant flora, and an exceptional fauna. The kindness and hospitality of the Zaïrean people will facilitate your knowledge of the tradition and folklore. Our young nation expects much from your suggestions, and thanks you for your contribution in helping it to welcome the friends you will send us in a much better way. Minister of the ECNT. That seems fair enough. It's the other section which makes you begin to worry a bit about what you might in fact find. You are meant to show it to any Zaïrois you actually meet, and it goes like this. Zaïrians, help our visitors. The friend holding this card is visiting our country. He is our guest. If he wants to take photographs, be polite and friendly to him. Do your best to have him enjoy his sojourn, and he will come back, bringing his friends with him. By helping him, you help your country. Never forget that tourism provides us with returns which allow us to create new jobs, to build schools, hospitals, factories, etc. On the welcome that our guest would have received will depend our touristic future. It's alarming enough that an exhortation like this should be thought to be necessary, but what is even more worrying is that this section is written only in English. No Zaïrian, or Zaïrois as they actually call themselves, speaks English, or hardly any do. The system by which Zaïre works, and which this card was a wonderfully hopeless attempt to correct, is very simple. Every official you encounter will make life as unpleasant for you as he possibly can until you pay him to stop it, in US dollars. He then passes you on to the next official, who will be unpleasant to you all over again. By the end of our trip, this process would assume nightmarish proportions, by comparison with which our first entry into Zaïre was a relatively gentle softening up process, and only consisted of 2 hours of rain and misery in huts. The first thing we saw in the customs hut was a picture which gave us a clue about how our expedition to find endangered wildlife in Zaïre was going to go. It was a portrait of a leopard. That is, it was a portrait of part of a leopard. The part of the leopard in question had been fashioned into a rather natty leopard-skin pillbox hat, which adorned the head of Marshal Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Ngbendu Waza Banga, the President of the Republic of Zaïre, who gazed down on us with a magisterial calm while his officials got to work on us. One was a large and fairly friendly man who occasionally offered us cigarettes, and the other was a small, nasty man who kept on stealing ours. This is, of course, the classic interrogation method, designed to bring the victim to the brink of pathetic emotional breakdown. It's obviously a technique they learnt somewhere and have just found the habit hard to break, even though all they actually wanted to know from us was our names, passport numbers, and the serial numbers of every single piece of equipment we had with us. The big man in particular seemed to wish us no personal ill, as he guided us gently through the insanity to which it was his duty to subject us, and I came to recognize a feeling I've heard described when oddly close and touching relationships develop between torturers and their victims, or kidnappers and their hostages. There is a feeling of all being in this together. The forms we had to fill in were headed Belgian Congo, crossed out with Zaïre written in pencil, which meant they had to be at least 18 years old. The only form they didn't seem to have was the only one we actually wanted. We had been warned by friends that we had to get ourselves a currency declaration form when we entered Zaire, or we would hit trouble later on. We repeatedly asked for one, but they said they had run out. They said we could get one in Goma, and that would be all right. They toyed with the idea of confiscating my Cambridge Z88 laptop computer, just in case we were planning to overthrow the government with it. But in the end, the small nasty man merely confiscated Chris's car magazine on the grounds that he liked cars. And then, for now, we were free. We went into the town of Bukavu in a sort of taxi-like thing. The town turned out to be an enormous distance from the airport, probably at the insistence of the taxi drivers. As we bounded along the appallingly rutted road that followed the margin of the lake, and along which a significant proportion of the population of Zaire seemed to be walking, our driver kept on diving beneath the dashboard of the car for long periods at a time. I watched this with some alarm, which was severely increased when I eventually worked out what it was he was doing. He was operating the clutch by hand. I wondered whether to mention this to the others, but decided that no, it would only worry them. Mark later mentioned that we had not passed any other motor vehicles at all on the drive, except for a couple of trucks, which had been parked for so long that they no longer had rear axles. I didn't notice this myself, because once I had identified what the driver was doing with the clutch, I simply kept my eyes closed for the remainder of the journey. When at last we arrived at the hotel, which was surprisingly airy and spacious for such a dilapidated town as Bukavu was, we were rattled and exhausted and started to yawn at each other a lot. This was a kind of unspoken code for being fed up with the sight of one another, despite the fact that it was only 6 in the evening. We each went off to our respective rooms and sat in our separate heaps. I sat by the window and watched as the sun began to go down over the lake, the name of which I couldn't remember because all the maps were in Mark's room. From this vantage point, Bukavu looked quite idyllic, situated on a peninsula which jutted into the lake. Lake Kivu, I remembered the name now. I was still feeling very jangled and jittery and decided that staring at the lake a bit might help. It was placid and silvery, shading to grey in the distance, where it met the fading shapes of the hills that surrounded it. That helped. The early evening light cast long shadows over the old Belgian colonial houses that were stepped down the hill from the hotel, huddled about with bright blossoms and palm trees. That was good too. Even the green corrugated roofs of the cruder new buildings were soothed by the light. I watched the black kites wheeling out over the water and found that I was calming down. I got up and I started to unpack the things I needed for the night, and at last a wonderful sense of peace and well-being settled on me, disturbed only by the sudden realization that I'd once again left my toothpaste in last night's hotel, and my writing paper, and my cigarette lighter. I decided it was time to explore the town. The main street was a grim hill, wide, dishevelled, and strewn with rubbish. The shops were for the most part concrete and dingy, and because Zaire is an ex-Belgian colony, every other shop is a pharmacy, just like in Belgium and France, except that none of them, as it happened, sold toothpaste, which bewildered me. Most of the other shops were in fact impossible to identify. When a shop appeared to sell a mixture of ghetto blasters, socks, soap, and chickens, it didn't seem unreasonable to go in and ask if they had any toothpaste or paper stuck away on one of their shelves as well. But they looked at me as if I was completely mad. Couldn't I see that this was a ghetto blaster, sock, soap, and chicken shop? Eventually, after trailing up and down the street for half a mile in either direction, I found both of them at a tiny street stall, which also turned out to sell ball pens, airmail envelopes, and cigarette lighters, and in fact seemed to be so peculiarly attuned to my needs that I was tempted to ask if they had a copy of New Scientist as well. I then realized that most of the essentials of life were available out on the street. Photocopying, for example. Here and there along the street were rickety trestle tables with big old photocopiers on them, and I had once or twice been hailed by a street hustler and asked if I wanted to have something photocopied or sleep with his sister. I returned to the hotel, wrote some notes on the writing paper, which for some reason was pink, and slept as if I was dead. The following morning we flew to the town of Goma. Here we discovered that even when making internal flights in Zaïre, you still had to go through the full rigmarole of immigration and customs controls all over again. We were held under armed guard while a large and thuggish airport official interrogated us in his office as to why we hadn't acquired any currency declaration forms at Bukavu.